The Tennessee Titans have found their man, Brian Callahan, named head coach of the team. Who's got play calling duties there? Raiders make it official as well, retaining Antonio Pierce now as full-time head coach. All of the head coach coordinator news around the coaching carousel in the NFL offseason. Coming up on today's Peacock and Williamson.
NFL analyst Brian Peacock and former NFL scout Matt Williamson bring you expert NFL analysis every day in less than 30 minutes. Get an inside look into the NFL on the field and in the front office. With elite breakdowns, next-level analysis, and in-depth information only for the real NFL fans. This is Peacock and Williamson, and it starts now.
Welcome to the Peacock and Williamson NFL Show. Brian Peacock alongside Matt Williamson, as always, at BD Peacock, at Williamson NFL. Get those mailbag questions in for tomorrow there on Twitter, or drop a question in the YouTube comments. Thanks, everybody, for making this your first listen on the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day. Love the YouTubers already subscribed on YouTube and everywhere you get your podcast. We're talking coaches today, Matt, and a big official hire. Well, two official hirings. One, we kind of had a feeling, interim named full-time head coach now, Antonio Pierce, the Raiders. But I want to start with the latest, which is the Tennessee Titans going on the offensive side of the ball, going with the younger offensive coach after the not old, but old school defensive-minded head coach, and you see that a lot in the NFL. They go offense to defense. They go brainiac play caller guy that doesn't work out to overseer CEO type. You see the defensive coach gets fired. They go with the offensive head coach, and that's exactly what happened with the Tennessee Titans here, going with Brian Callahan as their new head coach.
Yeah, and I wish I had all kinds of great things or terrible things to say about him. I don't know a ton. I mean, he has a good reputation. I think we all expected a young offensive-minded hire, and we got that, whether it's Levis or quarterbacks down the road. I think they wanted a different style of of head coach in general, but certainly developer of quarterbacks, and he did a really good job with Browning, and he certainly has contributed with Burrow, and they've had a good offense, although this past year it's kind of hard to judge. I mean, it's the weirdest Cincinnati season. You know, their defense fell apart. They lost their quarterback, and then, you know, you're hiring off that staff. I find that a little odd, but, you know, I get it. I mean, I figured this would be the style of coach they were going after.
Son of Bill Callahan, right? So football is a family business there. He knows the offensive side of the football. And according to Tom Pelissero of NFL.com, NFL Network, basically he came in for the second interview, and you hear a lot about that. It's like you don't want to let the guy out of the building. And we've seen so many second interviews happen around the league. More on that in a moment, especially the Atlanta Falcons going crazy on second interviews where guys were let out of the building. So either the guys didn't want to take the job that was being offered them, or they want to be thorough and interview everybody, and they're not worried about that head coach candidate going to another building and not being let out of that building. So that's interesting how long some of these jobs are taking with how many candidates are out there and how many interviews have already happened.
Does it feel like there's more interviews than ever? You know, like Atlanta just keeps interviewing people. I mean, like there's just so many guys getting interviewed at so many places.
Maybe I'm wrong, but we're sitting here on the 23rd of January, and most of the jobs are still open. And there was only, I think, one job filled, right? Until
they're not happening quick.
Pierce, you know, was the interim guy and was held on to. I don't talk more about Antonio Pierce. I think it was absolutely the right call for the Las Vegas Raiders there. But Gerard Mayo was an in-house guy. This is the first outside head coach that has been hired in the entire cycle. Still have 5 wide open jobs in the NFL. So it feels like this is going a lot slower. Maybe it's because there's so many open jobs, but there's a lot of really good candidates too. And I would think some teams out there are trying really hard to close the deal with some of these guys.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, is everyone fighting for Harbaugh and Belichick? Are they waiting on Lions OC, Ravens DC? I mean,
I have a feeling I think you nailed exactly what it is. I think it's teams are waiting for those big dominoes to fall first, the Belichick Harbaugh hires, and then they can move on to their next candidates. And I just think you need that face-to-face, and they got to wait until Super Bowl week or until the season is over for Mike McDonald, defensive coordinator of the Ravens, or the Lions offensive coordinators who's interviewed everywhere, right? He's super popular. I think he's number one-ish on a lot of these lists, and that has to be it, right? They're waiting for those guys that are still playing playoff games.
So the Raiders fell now, the Titans fell, Patriots already made their hire. So that leaves 5, right? I mean, it's off the top of my head here. We got Washington, Seattle, Chargers, Panthers, Falcons.
Correct. Yes.
So that's 5. Okay.
8 openings. Unbelievable. A third of the, a quarter of the league, right? Yeah. I always want to say a third of the league. A quarter of the league, not quite a third. That's a lot, though. A quarter of the league changeover. And 8 jobs open, and only 3 of those closed. 2 of those in-house hires with Gerard Mayo and Antonio Pierce. So one more note here on Brian Callahan before we get to some of the other open jobs and some
I definitely want to talk about it.
Positions that are open as well. What's going on in Philadelphia? But to wrap up the Brian Callahan hire for the Tennessee Titans, former Bengals offensive coordinator, and it looks like Brian Callahan will call the plays for the Tennessee Titans. So he's going to be the head coach and play caller. And this is interesting because Zach Taylor had some comment about Callahan's lack of play calling, because you see this a lot and we saw it with Mike McDaniel, and he was, Kyle Shanahan's right-hand man for a decade and never called plays because Kyle Shanahan's the play caller, but he's got a big part in game planning and everything. And then he gets the head coach job. He has to become head coach just so he can start calling his own plays. And we've seen that in Miami. This is what the head coach in Cincinnati, Zach Taylor, said about Callahan's lack of play calling. He said, quote, "That's just people that don't actually know. He needs to call plays. Why? Nobody can say that. It's something people parrot out there. He's been the coordinator here for 5 years. He coordinates everything having to do with it. He establishes the whole structure of our offense. On game day, he and I are in constant communication. That is calling plays. That is establishing an offense. He knows everything I go through on a daily basis as a head coach. He and I both. He's as prepared as anybody can be prepared for it." So, and that, scripts are part of play calling, and that has probably come up together between an OC maybe that doesn't even call plays and the actual play caller on game day. So sequencing, coming up with the plays, which, building the actual call sheet, knowing what the plan is. Maybe it's almost paint by numbers at that point for some coaches. It's on the sheet. Let's go. 2nd and 8. Well, I got a 2nd and 8 play. We already decided what that's going to be. So the play calling is almost elementary at that point, potentially.
Yeah, it's an interesting way of putting it. And the more I think about this fit in this hire, I think it's a real ringing endorsement from Tennessee ownership that they love Rand Carthon. Like Carthon and Vrabel didn't really see the eye to eye. I think there was a slight power struggle there. With all respect to Callahan, at his age, with his resume, he's not going to challenge the GM. He's just going to coach the team. And real quick on the play calling, maybe he's a whiz kid. I mean, by all accounts, that's why you're hiring him. Develop Levis, be a great play designer, offensive guru. Great. But I will say, I mean, this even happens to Andy Reid, that sometimes it's hard to be a head coach and a play caller if you've been doing it for 30 years. I mean, just, do I call a timeout now? I'm sitting here thinking about what the next play is. It's just a lot on game day and also throughout the week, game planning.
No doubt. And so he has to get his Brian Callahan now, because he's Zach Taylor.
Right.
He's going to be calling the plays, and he needs to get somebody to help him game plan and do all those things. And so staffs, of course,
is that guy going to be 22 years old or,
Yeah. And so there's a lot of changeover here. You need somebody to help you out. You need an assistant head coach. And so head coach is just the first part of it, and they've got to complete those staffs now. And that's usually a big part of those interviews as well. It's like, okay, who's your staff? Who you bringing with you? What is your process going to be? Because it's not a one-man show in those NFL buildings. There's so much going on, so much time, and so much tape watching that needs to happen that you can't shortcut. And you need a lot of really good people that are together, bringing those offenses and defenses together. So Tennessee Titans hire Brian Callahan. Hard to know exactly how that's going to go right now, but they seem to like him. He wasn't the hottest name out there, but his name was out there. Interesting one. And I think you're right about Rand Carthon, is he gets to hire his guy now. So now there's a working relationship. But when you think about Vrabel, if there was like a power struggle with Carthon and Vrabel, they just brought him in. Like Vrabel was part of bringing in that GM because he just had a power struggle with the old GM. So you start to see, well, who's the constant here? If every
maybe
single
one guy's hard to deal with,
no matter who the GM is, the head coach can't get along with him. So anyway, Brian Callahan, new head coach of the Tennessee Titans. Let's talk Raiders, Pierce, the Eagles hunting again now for new offensive and defensive coordinators for the second straight year. Notes on all the rest of the job openings as well. Today's episode of Peacock and Williamson is brought to you by FanDuel, America's #1 sports book. And now that we are approaching Championship Sunday, there is tons of ways to bet on not only that game, but the game a couple weeks later as well. Tons of NFL bets at FanDuel, America's #1 sports book. Draft props. I love me some parlays. And right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets guaranteed when you place a $5 bet. That's $150 in bonus bets, win or lose on that first $5 bet for new customers at FanDuel. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get started. Make that first bet a layup. And the app is super easy to use. Love the website interface. Live same game parlays. There's a new Explore tab to find bets in any sport out there, not just NFL. I mean, I do mean any sport you can think of out there. You can get involved at FanDuel. So visit FanDuel.com/lockedon. FanDuel, official partner of the NFL. Raiders and Antonio Pierce. They had some interviews, but in the end, it didn't seem like they were too hot on anybody's trail. If I'm not mistaken, they never interviewed Jim Harbaugh. Is that correct?
I don't think so. I was thinking the same thing. I'm like, did that ever happen or not? I don't think so.
Yeah. So anyway, Antonio Pierce, it kind of felt like that's the way it had to go. He obviously owned the locker room as interim head coach. You got to fill out his staff now as well around him because he's not, speaking of play callers, he's not going to be the play caller on either side of the ball. Maybe he is going to take over play calling duties on defense. I don't know. It's not been his thing. He is he's the overseer. He is the CEO. And I don't want to limit what Antonio Pierce can do as part of the organization, right? But his leadership is what got him this head coaching job. It is what got the Raiders pointed in the right direction last season when he took over as interim coach. And I think it's the hire that has to happen. And now Max Crosby doesn't have to request a trade, which he said he was going to do if they don't hire Antonio Pierce. That's how much they like them in the locker room. When your best player says that, I think you got to take notice of your ownership.
I think Devontae Adams said certainly backed him as well. There's been ringing endorsement from the players, which frankly is not a good enough reason to make a huge decision like this, but it certainly is in the good column, good versus bad. They were 5-4 with him taking over, and a noticeably different, better, more energetic team, especially the defense. I don't think that's a talented defense at all, but they played like a top 5 unit when he took over. So all those things have immense value, and maybe he's the next Harbaugh, Tomlin, Vrabel, young guy that lasts forever, who's not, totally on defense or totally on offense or whatever, more of a CEO like you mentioned. I do have concerns though. He's been a head coach for 9 games. He's been a coach period for like 2 or 3 years. He hasn't done this profession very long at all. And I'm going to say this about all hiring young defensive-ish, head coaches. Who's your OC? You mentioned that in the first segment. Like, you better come to me with a pretty strong OC/staff, because chances are, if you do a great job hiring your offensive coordinator, he's only going to be here a year or two, and then you're going to have to do it again. That's a concern to me when you hire a young defensive head coach.
According to reports, Pierce is trying to retain defensive coordinator Patrick Graham, who's got some head coach interviews of his own. I think he did interview for the head coach job for the Raiders as well. But they could keep largely the same defensive staff, which is a great start. But I think a lot of the offensive coaches are already gone. I know they lost their offensive line coach and a bunch of other assistant coaches as well. So it's going to be a whole new operation on the offensive side of the ball. And obviously that was Josh McDaniels' group to start with. So that shouldn't be surprising.
No, it shouldn't. And I'm not throwing cold water at all on this hire. I'm excited as could be about it. But, You don't have enough offensive staff. You don't have a quarterback, and you're not super talented. I mean, like, this could go really bad, whether he's a good coach or not. You know what I mean?
Pretty important. And
Yeah.
they could lose more games next year, even if they're coached better, too, just because of that factor and how things go on the offensive side of the ball. And then maybe you lose that extra juice that you had, that we've seen can be a very short-term thing with an interim head coach and the leadership thing. And that wears off if you start losing games and you're just under-talented. So interesting there, but you can't dislike the hire with the way we saw. I mean, and that was a good sample. It wasn't 3 games. That was, half a season.
Right. And this is going to happen to everyone. I mean, this is going to happen to the new coach in Tennessee, etc. But all the exuberance from his team will fall off him immediately when he looks like he can't handle what to do in 4th down, or doesn't know how to handle a training camp practice, or as soon as he looks in over his head. And this is the same as Tennessee. I mean, these are young guys that haven't done it, and that's the challenge of all new head coaches. It's a bigger job than you or I or Pierce or any of these people think. And the Belichicks and Reeds understand that, whether they've overstayed their welcome or not. Dealing with the media. I mean, if these guys at their opening press conference tomorrow or whatever, if they bumble and fumble, all of a sudden the arrows are going to start flying. It's just the way it is. It's a brutal job.
Yeah. And with so many of these, we're kind of reporting on the news and reacting to it, but you really don't know. And you got to see how it takes shape.
That's kind of my point. You just don't know.
Maybe he's the next Bill Belichick. Maybe Brian Callahan is the next Kyle Shanahan.
Yeah.
Son of a coach kind of thing. Maybe they both are fired. And we're talking about those openings in 12 months. We have no idea how that's going to go. But
I meant to mention this earlier. I apologize, but I love that he's the son of a coach. I'm sure he had to move his whole life, his family, his wife, his parents, his children probably understand the lifestyle. It's not a culture shock to them. Daddy used to be up on a podium getting yelled at. Fire this guy. His name's in the paper, and go to school, and people aren't nice to you because your dad had a bad game calling plays or something. Like, at least he's been down that road,
No doubt. How about this one? This one kind of makes me feel old. Dan Morgan, former linebacker.
Yeah, he was really good.
Of the Carolina Panthers. So David Tepper has his GM that is leading this coaching search, and tons of candidates there that we're hearing about for the Carolina Panthers. Doesn't really sound like there's one that's close there, though.
No, I love Dan Morgan as a player. It does make me feel old. I remember him at the U. I remember reading his draft profiles from, Mel Kiper when he came out. So there you have it,
Fascinating in Philadelphia. Did they
number 11 pick in the 2001 draft? I was trying to think, because I was at Pitt shortly after, and we used to play against the U in the Big East, and I know Morgan was there a little before we played them. I played him in the Vilma eras. We played against them, but wow, I can't believe.
I mean, he was a monster, big, athletic. He was a top 10 pick.
He was the number 11 pick in the 2001 draft.
11 and number 1, or in 2001. Yeah. Okay, yeah.
7 seasons in the NFL, all with the Panthers. Good career. I think. For what I remember, I think concussions derailed him.
What are the Philadelphia Eagles doing, Matt? I think we got to answer that question next. Some notes on some other coordinators and head coach job openings as well coming up. Today's episode of Peacock and Williamson brought to you in part by Gametime. Gametime is the fast and easy way to buy tickets for all of the sporting events, NFL games, music, comedy, theater events, concerts, whatever it is near you. Gametime has killer last-minute deals, all-in prices, views from your seat, and their best price guarantee. Gametime takes all of the guesswork out of buying tickets. And right now, all users, not just new users, all users get $100 off when they buy a big game ticket with code Vegas100. Head to the big game, go to the Gametime app, use code Vegas100, and get $100 off that big game ticket. Love the last minute deals, late deals, even up to an hour after the start of an event, football, basketball, baseball, concerts, you name it. You can find the tickets at Gametime. So take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Gametime. Right now, all Gametime users get $100 off big game tickets with code Vegas100. 100. Terms apply. Just download the Gametime app. Use code Vegas100 for $100 off a big game ticket. Or if you're not going to the big game, use code Locked On for $20 off your first purchase. Download Gametime today. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. Did offensive coordinator Brian Johnson and the group of defensive coaches there, did they get enough of an opportunity? Is this a knee-jerk reaction from Jeffrey Lurie ownership, Nick Sirianni, the head coach, on down in the organization? Because Sean Desai was there, and then they relieved him of play calling duties, and then it was just a really odd season for the Philadelphia Eagles and how quickly things fell apart. And they're blaming it on they're pointing at the coordinators, right? And Sirianni better choose the right coordinators this year, because he's going to be the one they're pointing at if this happens again next year. OC and DC jobs now open for the Philadelphia Eagles.
So I get the impression Sirianni's seat is now hot. Okay, you're going to be back, but you're going in with a hot seat, and you better make great coordinator changes or hires. We need to get back to where we were. The standard there is going to be very high. It's not going to be, hey, sneak us back into the playoffs, and we'll call that a successful year, even though their roster is getting a little worse. It's hard to maintain a Super Bowl caliber roster for 5, 6, 7 years. Maybe the Bills are about to experience such a thing. I think it's apparent that the Cardinals and Colts got two very good coaches, and me especially, underestimated those losses last offseason. You kind of think, the Eagles will be fine. They got a good D-line. They got Kelsey. They got Lane Johnson, Hurts. They'll be okay. But you lose two really, really good coordinators that look like they're going to be good head coaches. That's really, really hard to overcome. But rarely do I say this. I mean, during their slide, they looked like a poorly coached football team. They looked like they didn't practice hard. They had bad pad level, awful tackling. You could say, boy, they don't have many good players on the back seven, but their effort and angles and aggression certainly didn't translate. They had all kinds of issues trying to pick up blitzes, things like that just flat out reflect on a coordinator or a coach. Like, we're blitzing Hurts and he has no hots or no answers. You're going to lose.
Yeah, I think no answers is the way to put it.
No answers.
There was no answers in-house. There was no answers for the quarterback. There was no answers on how to fix those, how to answer those questions, right? There's no answer for anything, and they fell apart. They didn't know what to do. They were the one seed, the best team in the NFL. 2 weeks later, they're changing defensive play callers. I've never seen anything quite like it.
Me neither.
You had to believe probably early on in the process they were like, oh no, maybe this coordinator thing is it going to be more of a problem? Because remember how they won all those close games earlier on in the year, and they didn't really look great. And it was like, this is just a good team and winning close games. And it was like, actually, no, they were kind of struggling all year, but they were winning those games. Then it kind of all just fell apart.
It really did. I mean, you kind of mentioned something like, I don't remember anything like it. Like, I can remember, we've been watching football for 1,000 years or commenting on it for 1,000 years. You can be like, well, they had two really bad injuries. They lost their defensive stud and their quarterback, and the second half of the season was a disaster. Okay.
Right.
And not that the Eagles were perfectly clean in injuries, but they just looked like a different football team. I mean, they did not at all resemble what we had come to know they are,
Oh, and think about where the stock was for Jalen Hurts and Nick Sirianni before the season started. And that's supposed to be, you have that marriage of great head coach, great quarterback. You're supposed to be able to overcome some of those other things, roster-wise and, coaching-wise, because when you're a good team, you're going to get poached, and it fell apart.
And, oh, by the way, nobody wants to blame Hurts, and I'm not even saying I'm super worried about him, but they just gave him a huge contract, and I don't know how you ignore that, I mean, so while you were talking there, I just did a real quick search, and I did EPA from weeks 11 till the end of the season, which is when their losing streak started. The only defenses that were worse than the Eagles are Seattle, the Cardinals, and Washington. I mean, that's bottom of the league. And Washington and the Cardinals don't have any good players on that side of the ball.
A couple
The
more
offense
notes.
at least was above average. I mean,
Right.
at least was somewhat respectable.
Yes. And then they had their own problems too. Once they lost AJ Brown, it was almost like, well, that's it. How are we supposed to do this now? Which obviously is something that can't happen with how good their offensive line is too. So
I'm with you though. No answers. Like, okay, something bad happened to you. Something happens bad to every team, but have some kind of answer. Don't just throw your hands up in the air like, well, I guess we're going to lose.
So reports out of Atlanta are that it's not Belichick or bust there. They had Belichick for a second interview, had Harbaugh in for a second interview. Now they're doing more second interviews with Raheem Morris, who's popular right now, getting I think a second interview with Washington as well. Then there is Bobby Slowik is also having a second interview with the Atlanta Falcons. So some of these in-person interviews now, especially for some of the coaches that were in the playoffs. And so maybe the Falcons really aren't hard after, one of those whales that we had talked about. And then now Jim Harbaugh going on a second interview with the Los Angeles Chargers that Matt, you and I both thought that was probably one of the best fits there.
Yeah.
Ben Johnson, as we mentioned, Lions OCs in the NFC Championship game. He's popular with a lot of jobs, including Washington's. Mike McDonald, Ravens defensive coordinator as well, is a popular target with a lot of jobs. So I have a feeling there's a lot. I would say Belichick, Harbaugh, Johnson is really what we're waiting on here. Because I think those three guys are probably number one on some teams list, maybe multiple teams list, and nobody's ready to move on to the second guy until their first guy's gone.
So real quick, I want to talk about Slowik because meteoric rise, almost too fast. Like Johnson was here a year ago. Like it seems like another year before you should really be a candidate. Do some interviewing. Stock probably went down a little this past weekend, although expectations shouldn't have been sky high that they were going to walk into Baltimore and blow them out or anything. But there's only 5 spots. And if we musical chair it, I think the Titans hire today really hurts Slowik. Like I thought that's a spot he could land. If there's only 5 jobs, I guess we don't know this for a fact, but I sure like the chances of Vrabel, Harbaugh, Belichick, Johnson getting 4 of the 5, and McDonald seems like a really strong candidate for the other. I mean, could Vrabel go to the booth for a year or something like that? I don't know. So they're filling kind of quick is my point. Like when the Pierces and Callahan start taking them and none of the whales have grabbed them yet, where do the whales land?
Yeah, the Texans might squeak out here and hold on to Slowik for one more year. Yeah, he's kind of 1 year behind where Ben Johnson is. And if the Texans do what they did again, and he's had his second full season as the offensive coordinator there, he'll be Ben Johnson next year, and everyone's going to have him in, and he'll be the number 1 or 2 candidate on everybody's list.
Yeah.
And we'll see if he's
looks like a star. You're right.
Yeah, and Raheem Morris is another one that might get that shot. He's been an offensive coach, he's been a defensive coach, he's been a head coach. He's still relatively young because of how fast he rose early in his coaching career. He's been with McVay. He's been with Shanahan's. So he's got a really interesting resume. Raheem Morris does, currently defensive coordinator of the Rams, and he's going on a tour of second interviews as well. So maybe there's some whales that don't have jobs this year, Matt.
I'm glad you mentioned Morris because not that I know him or I'm best friends with Mike Tomlin or anything like that, but Mike Tomlin's best friend in coaching is Raheem Morris. And on the air, on the record, off the record, he just raves about this guy could be, he's in a great situation, but he could be a star. He's a superstar coach. So I'm kind of rooting for him. Question to you though, if let's say the Ravens win the Super Bowl, if you're McDonald, would you rather run it back or go be the Panthers head coach? You know what I mean? Like, one of those 5 jobs is Carolina, and I don't know that I want it. Or if Harbaugh leaves, maybe McDonald takes the Michigan job. I don't, or something like that. He was D coordinator there a little bit ago.
Yeah, it's fair to ask the question: is being the Ravens defensive coordinator better than being and the Panthers fans are going to get mad at us. They're going to be in the YouTube comments, but that's where your ownership has put this thing right now.
Like Spagnuolo is a great example. Would you rather be Steve Spagnuolo and be Andy Reid's right-hand man and have a bunch of rings?
Ultimate job.
Try to rebuild the Panthers.
because that you better get it paid a lot, and you better not have offsets in your contract, because you could be one and done, two and done. And now you're like, okay, now I'm out of a job. And I had this great defensive coordinator job. Now I got to go back and find another defensive coordinator job in a year or two that's not as good as the defensive coordinator job I had before.
Right.
So it's something to think about. But,
but
money talks as well. Money talks. And so,
oh yeah, and Carolina's got that. I mean, you will be rich.
There's a big difference between what the Carolina head coach gets paid and what the Ravens defense coordinator gets paid.
Yeah, well, exactly. Yeah. And even like Frank Reich, I'm sure, is sitting on a beach right now listening, should I be an offense coordinator or not? I got a lot of money in the bank and life is pretty good.
Fascinating. Oh, yeah. And then there's those whispers of Andy Reid over the weekend potentially being close to the end, and maybe has a decision to make at some point. And so
takes a lot out of you.
Will there be another whale on the market? Probably not, but we'll see. Fascinating stuff out there. And of course, Matt and I, as we do, will have it covered for you every single day here on Peacock and Williamson. Get those mailbag questions in, championship weekend questions, draft questions, wherever your team is in this NFL postseason, offseason. Drop us your questions at BD Peacock, at Williamson NFL on the socials, or drop a question in the YouTube comments. Matt and I back tomorrow. Peacock and Williamson.